Mikel Arteta has been developing a tiny little savior complex that I've never seen anyone talk about. He has signed a few players that were rejects at other clubs or were declining, and those transfers haven't fully worked out as well as I think he'd hoped. Before anyone starts twisting my words, Arteta has signed some great players and he's made some smart signings, but I want to talk about the few that I think weren't that great and the ones where he tried to work some tactical magic but it didn't go to plan. First up, Zinchenko and Gabriel Jesus. Look, I know that at the time they were fine signings and had a good first season. They helped get Arsenal from fifth to second. However, I think they were both failed long term experiments and fit perfectly into this savior complex Arteta kinda has. Zinchenko at Man City is a player I never rated as an individual. He was always a defensive liability, and he was never really a nailed on starter because he simply wasn't good enough. In his last season at City, it was clear that João Cancelo was a much better version of him, and Zinchenko was never going to find success at City. Same thing could be said for Gabriel Jesus. Even when City got rid of Aguero, Pep didn't want to play Jesus as a striker because he isn't a great number 9. He would play Foden at false 9 and they still won the league. Jesus had some good times at City, but he was a backup and was never going to get his place as a starter in that team. Then, what does Arteta do? He brings them both in from Man City because he's worked with them before and they know the system. In the first season, they were good signings, improved Arsenal massively, but to me, they never looked like they were going to be significant past that point. Fast forward a couple of years, and now they are both sitting on the bench and are nowhere near being starters. When they first signed, they were ideal long term players for Arteta. They knew the system, but he tried to take two players that weren't good enough and turn them into something they are not. It was clear that he thought he could make it work. He thought he could take two City rejects and show everyone why he can be an elite coach, but it didn't work long term. Zinchenko offers very little outside of passion, and Jesus is a striker who doesn't know where the goal is. I posted this on TikTok, and many people argued that I was wrong for thinking they were bad signings because they were supposed to be short term signings. I'm sorry, but you do not spend £45 million on a 25-year-old striker to just have him as a short term signing. Jesus was definitely meant to be a long term player, but Arteta soon realized that this guy isn't good enough for where he wants the team to be. And then he went and signed a replacement for Jesus, but also for Zinchenko. This was a very, very clear example of Arteta thinking that he could save two players and turn them into superstars in his system that he borrowed from their old coach, Pep Guardiola. This is just how I see it. I think they were meant to be long term signings, but simply didn't work out, which was very predictable. The money could have been spent way better. The next player is King Kai Havertz. Me and a lot of people will fundamentally disagree about this one because I don't think Havertz is a great player, but many people do. However, you cannot deny that this is a perfect example of someone trying to save a player from a bad situation. There is no reasonable explanation for buying Kai Havertz other than the fact that you want to prove to people that you can turn a reject into a top player. At Chelsea, Havertz was a colossal flop. I don't care that he scored the winner in a Champions League final. I'm not a Chelsea fan. That means absolutely nothing to me. All he showed at Chelsea was that he was nothing special technically or physically. He was one of the most hated players in the league, and everyone collectively agreed that he wasn't great. But here comes Arteta. At the time, there was no one that could justify Arteta buying Kai Havertz. Do you know how many players he could have bought instead? He spent 70 million on Kai Havertz and experimented on him for half a season. He brought him in and played him in that left center mid position, but Havertz involved himself in the play as little as possible. He tried to play him as a number 10, but one that only runs in behind and does nothing else. He bought a declining player for 70 mil and started doing experiments with him. They needed a real midfielder at the time, but instead he put Havertz there and tried to turn him into something special. Then he realized that this midfield experiment didn't work and Havertz eventually found himself back at striker. I don't think he's a good striker. He is not the killer that Arsenal needs to win the league. He isn't that striker that will score 20 plus goals, and I think Arteta has realized that as well, and Arsenal will be searching for a striker very soon, and Havertz will find himself on the bench, and that will overall be a disaster signing. The last two players are Sterling and Jorginho. I won't be too harsh about these because they are both backups and aren't really meant to be key players in this team at any point, but they fit this idea of Arteta signing rejects or declining players and hoping for a miracle. To be fair to Jorginho, I think he's been decent at times, but if Arsenal were smarter with that Havertz money, Jorginho would not have had to be bought in January to fix that hole in midfield. Is he the best they could have got? Obviously not, but he did a job. It's just interesting how it was a player that another club didn't want at all anymore. Then we have Raheem Sterling. This loan deal has been an absolute disaster. How on earth do you upgrade on a loan move when you are performing at horrible levels? Sterling had a terrible season at Chelsea and somehow got a loan move to a title challenging team at the time. Again, I know he's a backup, but he's still terrible. Arsenal are crying out for quality on that left hand side, and instead of buying a promising player or maybe an unknown hidden gem, they get the worst version of Sterling the world has ever seen. Arteta, you could not save this guy. There was no need to specifically go out and get Sterling. It doesn't matter if it's a loan. Loan players are still supposed to offer something to the team, and Sterling hasn't done that at all. Just because he used to be good doesn't mean he will offer anything now. And don't be surprised when Casemiro is playing at the Emirates next season. Arteta is the type of manager to do that because he thinks he's better than he actually is. He should stick to what he's been doing a lot, buying for the future and long term. Stay away from these rejects just because you think you're good enough to make it work.